Managing and configuring a nano server involves getting it onto the network, and then getting it onto the domain, as well as remotely managing our nano servers, whether it's in a workgroup environment or a domain environment, and then of course installing roles and features, all of which we're going to do in this nugget. Let's jump into the virtual nugget lab and get started. In a previous nugget, we learned how to stand up a nano server. We used PowerShell to generate a VHDX, attached it to a virtual machine, fired it up, and then got onto that nano server and took a look around. I took one of those machines that we built in that previous nugget, our web server specifically, and brought it out into our lab environment. And there is NanoNug ready to go. Now, right now, NanoNug is all by itself. It's not a domain joined machine, it's a member of a work group. So the first thing we're going to look at here is how to remotely manage a nano server that's a member of the work group. Then our next order of business is to get it onto the domain. We have a domain controller here in DCNug, which is hosting the nuggetlab.com domain. It's also our DNS server. Now, another thing I want to point out here is that when we created this NanoNug VHDX, we did apply a networking layer to it. So we assigned the IP of 192.168.1.115. We also gave it some DNS servers. Our primary DNS server is 192.168.1.100, and that is pointing to DCNug, our DNS server. So that's going to handle internal name resolution. We also have 8.8.8.8 is a secondary DNS server, which is a Google public DNS server, which will allow us to get out and resolve names on the internet. We're going to need that when we get into package management because we're going to hit an online package repository to download nano server roles and features. So we're going to need to do all of this on our DCNug machine because, as you know, there's not much we can do locally on a NanoNug machine with that recovery console. So let's head up to DCNug here, paste the password in, and log in. Let's begin on DCNug by launching File Explorer and opening up the Nugget Lab directory in the root of the C drive. We have a PowerShell script in here full of one-liners that we're going to be walking through, so give that a right click and choose Edit to launch that script right in to the integrated scripting environment. So again, NanoNug is all by itself in its own workgroup. So what would happen if we were to attempt to remotely manage that machine right now? Well, let's give it a whirl here. Let's do an enter PS session. And let's pass in for the computer name here. We're going to have to pass in the IP address because there's no DNS record on this machine for NanoNug. That'll all happen when we join the domain. So we're going to need to pass in the IP address here, 192.168.1.115. And we also need to pass in the credential parameter. Otherwise, it'll attempt to use the credentials of the local user, which is the domain administrator, and obviously that's not going to work. So I'm going to pass in parentheses here, get credential, just like so. That way it'll prompt us. So if we hit enter right now, it's going to say, okay, what are your credentials? We'll go ahead and pass in the credentials of that local administrator account over there on NanoNug. And this is going to say, no, sorry, you can't do it. And there's a number of reasons that this will fail. And I guarantee you throughout your PowerShell career, you'll see this message more than you want to. So whenever you see this message, it could be a number of things. Number one, the networking layer could be improperly configured. Now, we know that's not the case for us because they are on the same network with the same gateway. In fact, we could just run a real quick test here with the command prompt, and we could try to ping 192.168.1.115. So we're good there. Networking layer, just fine. Number two, remote management could be disabled. Even though remote management is enabled by default, somebody may have turned it off. Number three, the firewall could be preventing it. Even though we're using PowerShell remoting here, which uses HTTP, it's always a possibility. But really, what this is for us is it's a trust issue. See this right here? This last little part of the message here is about trusted hosts. So because we're not in a domain environment, we have no trust relationship between our domain controller here and that machine over in the workgroup. And you also may need to add machines across domain bounds when you are in a domain environment into the local trusted host to set up that trust relationship. Setting up that trust is pretty straightforward. You can use PowerShell's generic set item commandlet here to get into the WS management configuration and add it to the trusted host list. You can also use the old WinRM command line utility to do the same thing. We're going to use PowerShell here, and all we're going to do is add the IP address of that nano server to the trusted host list here on our DCNug machine. So place your cursor on line number 5 there, hit run selection, and that will do it. Also, make sure that you choose yes here with the message box. You can also pass a force flag over to bypass this message, but we're good. Now, I'm going to head back down here to the shell, and I'm going to recall our last command. Let's see if this works now. Enter your credentials, and look at that. We are on our machine. Now, we can run a host name just to verify that, in fact, 192.168.1.115 is NanoNug. And we can take a look at our IP configuration here, too. Let's run an IP config with the all switch just to make sure we have everything set up accordingly. We do. There's the IP. There's the gateway. We've got our DNS servers set up as well. Now let's exit out of our remote session here and take a look at how we can get this machine onto the domain. Remember, there is no built-in way of doing this in NanoServer, at least from the recovery console, and it doesn't support the add computer commandlet. So we're going to need to use the djoin utility to generate a blob and then perform an offline domain join remotely on that machine. Now, before we do that, let's create another session over to our NanoNug machine. Only this time, rather than enter directly onto that session, we're just going to create it and store it inside of a variable named nano. So notice we're not doing an enter PS session, but a new PS session with the same parameters that we passed in earlier. So this is cool because then we can reuse this session whenever we need to. And I'm actually going to show you a really cool commandlet here with a new parameter on it that will allow us to copy files over to that machine through the session. And then we'll enter into that session and do some things on it. So first things first here, let's run line number 8 here, which will again create that session and store it in the variable. So I'm going to go ahead and pass in our credentials for that NanoNug machine. And as soon as you see the prompt come back, it's done. So now we have a session. In fact, you can highlight just the variable, run that selection, and it'll give us some information about that session. Now we're ready to get this machine onto the domain. And the first thing we need to do is harvest the blob from a domain join machine. And we just happen to be on our domain controller here, so this is the perfect machine to do it. But you can do this from any domain join machine. What this will do is provision a new computer account in Active Directory for the machine that we specify here. So we specify our domain name, specify the name of the machine that we want pre-staged there in Active Directory, and then we're going to save this blob to a file because we're going to need that file over on our NanoNug machine to complete the process and actually perform the offline domain join. So place your cursor on this line here, hit run selection, and that'll just take a second, and now it says that the provisioning process was completed successfully. You can actually verify this by getting right into Active Directory users and computers. In fact, let's take the shortcut to doing that right now. Right click on the start button, head up to run, type in dsa.msc. That'll fire up Active Directory users and computers, and look at that, it took us right into the computers node, and there is our NanoNug machine. So it's been pre-staged in Active Directory. Now we have something that we can easily hook into from our NanoNug machine when we complete the process. All right, so I'm going to close out of this. Now we need to take that file, which by the way is named nuggetlab.blob, and you can actually see it here in our NuggetLab directory. There it is. And we need to send it over to our NanoNug machine. And that's where this next commandlet, which by the way has been expanded here in PowerShell 5.1 to make it very easy to copy files across PowerShell sessions because it supports this brand new parameter called toSession. There's also a from session parameter if you wanted to take something off a machine. But this makes it extremely simple to copy files between machines, because all we need to do is specify our local path, which we're referencing nuggetlab.blob, and our destination. We're just going to put this in the root of the C drive, and then the session that we want to copy it to, which is why we created that session and stored it in a variable. Now place your cursor on that line, once again hit run selection, and that's going to copy that file over to our NanoNug machine. All right, let's scroll down a little bit here, and let's enter that session that we created. So we can run an enter PS session, and this time we'll just pass to the session parameter our nano variable that we created that contains that session. So place your cursor on line 17 there, hit run selection, and that's going to get us right on to that machine. Check it out. Here we go. And now I'm going to navigate back to the root of the C drive there. And now if we run a dir, or get child item, it should show us our nuggetlab.blob lives in the root of the C drive. So now we can use this file along with djoin on our NanoNug machine to complete the process. So here we're going to request an offline domain join. We're going to use the load file parameter here to pass in the path to that blob file. We also need to specify our Windows path, and then we're going to say target to local OS. Since we're not targeting an image, we're doing this as an online operation. So place your cursor on that line, hit run selection. That'll just take a second, and the last thing it's going to need us to do here is reboot. So we can run a restart computer. I'm also going to put a semicolon followed by exit. That way it'll reboot and exit our session here in one shot. So go ahead and run that selection, give it a second, and when it comes back online, it'll be a member of the domain. So our NanoNug machine should now be a member of the domain. Let's use the recovery console to verify that. Let's flip over to our NanoNug machine, and let's log in here using the domain administrator account. So we'll type in administrator, enter the password, and down here for domain, type in nuggetlab.com. This should work, and if it does, we are now on the domain. Check that out. We're no longer a member of the work group. We're logged in as the domain administrator, and everything looks good. All right, I'm going to escape to log out of this and head back to DCNug. Now, it's also good practice after you do this to remove that trusted host entry. So all we need to do is just blank out our IP address here, and then run this line one more time. Hit yes here, and there we go. If you want to verify that, we can actually turn this set into a get item, and then just ignore the end here and run it just like so. This will query the trusted host, and you can see that we now have nothing in there. All right, let's move on and talk about how to install packages, roles, and features here onto our Nano server. First, let's run an enter session, this time rather than use a variable or use an IP address, we're just going to go right against the DNS name because our DNS entry was also configured. In fact, if you want to verify that, we can quickly right-click on Start, head up to Run, type in dnsmgmt.msc to launch DNS Manager. We can head into our nuggetlab.com domain, and look at that. There's NanoNug with this IP address. So DNS is all set up and configured. Now we can just run an enter PS session using the computer name NanoNug, and this should get us right on to our NanoNug machine. There we are. All right. So everything is done here through package providers and the packages that they provide. In fact, I'm going to come down here to the shell and just type in find package provider. This is going to give us a list of all the online repositories that we can hit to download and install packages here onto a NanoServer installation. So go ahead and choose yes at the message here, and this should return that list. And there are the current package providers that we can use. So what we're interested in here is the NanoServer package provider right there. So what we need to do is install this package provider first. So we're going to run install package provider, pass in the name of the provider. I'm going to go ahead and run that selection. Choose yes to all to confirm, and that will install it. The next step then is to import that package provider so we can use it. So I'm going to go ahead and run our next line of code there, and that will import it. And now we can access all the packages in that provider. And by the way, you can do a search of what these package providers provide as far as packages go by running a find package provider and then the name of the provider. Let's do PowerShell get here, for instance. Let's head down to the bottom, and let's do a find package. And for the provider name here, let's pass in PowerShell get, just like so. And look at them all. That list is just going to keep going and going and going. Lots of packages in that provider that we could download and make use of. Now let's take a peek inside of the NanoServer package provider. And by the way, doing that import actually gave us access to NanoServer package specific command lists. In fact, if we do a find dash and start typing in N for nano, you can see right there, find NanoServer package. So we can use the generic command list to hit any package provider, or this one that came with that import just to specifically search out the NanoServer package provider. I'll use the generic command line here. Just place our cursor right on that line, hit run selection, and that'll give us a list of all the packages that are currently available for NanoServer. And look at that, pretty much all of the ones that came with the installation media that we looked at in a previous nugget. We can also view the currently installed packages by running a get package and passing in the provider. So if we do a get package and pass in for the provider name here, NanoServer package, and execute that line, that's going to show us all the installed packages here, and we have a couple of them. We have IIS because we baked that into our image in a previous nugget. We have the guest package, the server data center, and the foundation package. And then I also added a couple of updates. I performed an update of our NanoServer because, believe it or not, the base image for NanoServer will not allow you to install the NanoServer package provider. You'll get an error of an invalid cab version. So that's why I needed to do that for all of this stuff. But what we're going to do now is get the storage package onto this. So we'll do an install package, specify the name of the package, and this should do it. Go ahead and confirm the message here with a yes to all. And there we go. And notice this package will require a reboot to complete installation on our NanoServer. Now if we run a get package again, we should also see that package as a part of the installed packages on this machine. There it is. And by the way, there is an uninstall package command line as well. So if you ever wanted to remove a package from a machine, just run that command line and pass in the name of the package. Now the last thing I want to show you, now that we have our NanoServer all set up and ready to go, is how we can remotely manage it using Server Manager. So fire up Server Manager, drop down that Manage menu, and choose Add Servers. Now if we browse Active Directory, we should see our NanoNug machine in there. We can add that to the selected list, hit OK, and now it should be in here available for us to manage. And notice because we have a restart pending, it's going to let us know there's a restart pending on that machine. And you can actually perform that restart right here using the GUI. But now if we hit IIS, we should see NanoNug in here. And if we hit File and Storage Services, before we would have only had DCNug, now we have both. So now we could even through the GUI here create shares and do all that wonderful stuff graphically against our remote NanoNug machine. And that's that for NanoServer. A little different than installing, configuring, and managing a desktop experience or server core installation option, but it has a lot of potential, and we're going to be working with NanoServers throughout the rest of this course, especially when we get into storage and failover clustering. In this CBT Nugget, we learned how to manage and configure NanoServer. We saw how to remotely administer a non-domain joined NanoServer. We saw how to join a NanoServer to the domain, as well as manage that domain joined machine. And then we got familiar with package management and how to use packages to install roles and features on a NanoServer. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.